I want to welcome everybody back to the webinars that we've been running over the summer that we're calling Members Matters, or Member Matters, I guess. And, this has always been, and what we've tried to create here is an opportunity for all of you to be able to share with each other what you're doing in your districts, and really trying to help each other during this process. And now that we're in the space where districts are looking at reopening of schools, I am sure as you are each grappling with your plans locally, there are probably many questions that have come up, and this is going to be a great opportunity, not so much to ask questions of MASB, but ask questions of each other and maybe give some solutions to each other as you struggle with, I think, what are really tough discussions at the local level. And I've had over the last few weeks as we have had the council recommendations and the executive orders related to return to school, people talking about it would have been easier if the governor would have just mandated things to happen. And the thing is, and I think I might have said it even actually on the last webinar that we had in the chat function anyways, we are a state, if you've done any, watching this year or traveling this year, the COVID pandemic has hit different parts of the states very differently. I've even heard on some of our webinars, even within the regions that have been created, schools have been hit very differently. And so there probably is really no other solution than to have these decisions at the local level, at least most of them, so that you can make decisions with your superintendent and leadership team that best fit the community that you serve, because we're in a much different place. As it is, we have regions that are in phase 5 and phase 4, and probably some that are at risk if we don't get things under control, dropping back into 3. And so I don't know that it's not an easy answer for boards that have to make the decisions and take the votes, but from our perspective at MASB and thinking about the one size fits all approach rarely works in our state or anywhere else, that this was I think a logical place. So today I do want to go into that space to talk about what each of you are doing. I did get some questions unsolicited from members that when we put out the posting for the meeting, and I want to touch on them. Might answer a few questions that are out there. Jen Smith and Brad Banasic are on also again today to answer any questions, but I don't want to turn this into a Q&A. I'm sure if you have questions, we'll try to answer them, but we do want to do some sharing. Just a few things that came up. One board member really got into some questions about social distancing, recommendations for staff related to classrooms with, elementary classrooms if kids aren't wearing masks. What do we do if somebody is testing positive? Those are all questions that really, both on the front end, I think the school district in your preparedness plan needs to be talking to your local health departments in crafting that plan, to think about what you're going to do. And then if those instances arise, if you have a student or a teacher that becomes ill and has a positive test, that's another thing where you're going to work with your local health department. There is not a state answer that's going to come, whether it be from MASB or the governor or the legislature. This is going to come from you working with your local health department to figure out what makes the most sense. Yes, referencing CDC guidelines will be, I think, beneficial, but you are going to want to reach out. And I have heard from districts that kind of the wherewithal within each county health department is different, just like like we see it with ISDs in the state of Michigan. Not all are created equal, not all are funded the same way. But anything when you get into the health space, I would look at your local health department. If for some reason that is not effective, you may also, and I've heard from districts that are reaching out and partnering with local hospitals. Like that would be another place, but it's definitely consulting with your kind of health professionals on that. Another question that came up, and I'll have Brad touch on this, this has come up multiple times over this summer, But the question really gets into what legal responsibility and liability does a district have, whether it be to a staff member or a student that becomes ill as you've put together your plan. So Brad, if you'd touch on that just to kind of address the concerns that I know members have in that space.
Sure. Well, in most cases, school districts are going to be protected by governmental immunity. Governmental immunity protects school districts and school boards when they're engaged in a governmental decision. The governmental decision is when they have authority under law to make that decision. So, in the case of reopening schools and protecting students and protecting staff, as long as school boards and school districts are following the EO, following current law, following the roadmap, you're going to be protected under governmental immunity based upon decisions that you make. Now, if you make a decision that's contrary to the executive order, so you're in phase 4 and decide not to follow any of the requirements in the executive order relating to phase 4, you're acting outside the scope of your authority when you're doing that as a school district or a school board. And that could expose the school district to liability. You lose that shield of governmental immunity in that case. So I guess in simplest terms, Don, as long as districts are complying with the executive order and the roadmap, you're making decisions based on your governmental decision-making authority, and you'll be protected by protected with governmental immunity.
All right, thanks, Brad. That's, I think, we always say it to districts. I mean, and partly, I think, as you think about your preparedness plans, probably wouldn't hurt you to also, touch base with your local council that, advises your school district in the space related to, hey, how are we doing and what we're adopting. But I think what Brad said is, if you're making good faith effort to follow the mandatory items, and that you've had, thorough discussions on the recommended, so you've made decisions for good reason, you're going to be in a good space related to that. Another question came up from a board member. They have heard, and maybe many of you have heard, that Lansing Public Schools has already announced that they are, at least through through early November, they are going to be completely online. And the question that came up from one of our members in that space is, how are they managing that? Are they working under a waiver for online instruction? Do they, how are they dealing with days and hours? And, is there, do you face the possibility of budgetary cuts for doing this? And I think some of those questions are still up in the air. And I'll have Jen address, efforts that we're making along with pretty much everybody in education to try to get the legislature to deal with being flexible as possible with days and hours and online learning. Jen, if you want to quickly touch on that, just to not so much answer the Lansing question, but talk about that broader, what we're trying to get accomplished.
So we've submitted multiple requests for the 75% attendance requirement to count a day to be waived for all of next year. We know that if you go to a hybrid option, you're not going to have kids in school all day. We know that you're going to possibly have parents that don't want to send their kids every day. But we want you to be able to count the day. So we've been pushing really since this all began for that to be waived. The other piece that we have been talking about is pupil count and allowing you to use last year's pupil count, because then you would have a solid number to base your budget on. And again, with not knowing what October is going to look like, the idea that you'll be able to count all of your students in October on the count day is really questionable. So the idea behind our asks have been to not tie you to the 75% so that you're still able to do your 180 days, and also be able to solidify your pupil count for next year. Recently, last week, a letter went out from the Department of Education and the statewide education organizations asking legislative leadership and the appropriations chairs to make those changes this week when the budget bill passes. We expect both a general fund and a school aid fund budget to pass this week to finalize this year, the state's fiscal year budget. And that's the one that we've been telling you about, that they reached a deal that there will be a cut to the per pupil, but there will be a 2-to-1 replacement of dollars with CARES Act funding into the budget. It was announced Monday that an agreement, a final agreement, which is never final till they vote, has been reached, and that will run this week, probably today and tomorrow. The House is only in this week. The Senate comes back next week. So we've been pushing them to take care of that now. It is something they could do in this bill that's running and give you some stability going forward. There's also a package of legislation that's moving in the House that it could be done in that, but we don't know the timeline for that one. And the longer this takes, the more up in the air it is for all of you as far as planning. So those are a couple of the big things we've been doing on pupil count and attendance.
Thanks, Jen. And to get back into that Lansing question, because somebody posed something. So their plan is complete 100% online with their normal start date, and that running through early November. So it's not that they're not going to have education in that period of time, but they are at least considering a return to face-to-face. It would not surprise me, though. I think part of this is a test run for them. They've got, I think, pretty uniform access right now in their school district, but they still have to figure out devices and how, like, just the process will work. It would not surprise me in Lansing and maybe in some of our other more populated areas that a district may look at, 100% virtual through the course of the year. And we have a number of districts that are offering, and it's one of the questions I think I'll pose to all of you. We're seeing, I don't know if it's a majority yet, but a lot of districts in their reopening plans are offering an online option or a face-to-face option. I know a number of the districts in the Lansing area are doing that. The district that I live in is doing that. And even how they're addressing that online learning component versus from a seat time and student count perspective. I think everybody would like to see happen what Jen talked about and try to get some of that language in legislation. And I don't think there's been any outright objection amongst the legislature. It's just they have not been around, so it's pretty hard to get them to do work when they are back in their districts. We had one, Ann Hamming asked the question about face masks. A few of you chimed in on that. That is a question that was posed to the governor's office. I think the CDC has come out and said that the face masks and shields do not work in the same way, but that's still, at least in the state of Michigan, up for question with the governor's office if they are going to, in fact, create some flexibility there. Just like much of the recommendations recommendations that came out of the council, there is a place here where it's not about being equal in protection. It's about mitigating risk in some amount versus not having them at all. So they may come out and say that it works. They may come out and say that it's, they can't. Maybe they say that a teacher can wear them as long as they keep distance from the kids, but the kids themselves can't use them unless it's medically necessary. So that is still a question that's being posed that hasn't been answered at this time. And as soon as we hear an answer in that space, and I know Jen posted, as it relates to the last Views webinar that we did with Governor Whitmer and her staff, we are still working with them to get to a full FAQ out of that, but that is not complete at this time. We'll be sending out a really short one this week. A group of us sat down last week, really more on the kind of, most of it focused on the collective bargaining aspect and kind of the makeup of your work groups. And we just finalized that yesterday, but that's really only about 4 questions and it doesn't get into any of the health side things, just kind of best practice as it relates to working in the preparedness plans and trying to get them created. And one other question that came up was the regions. And I mentioned it in my open, that there are sometimes distinct differences between one county and another within this, within a region. And I know there are conversations happening both at the legislative arena, in the governor's office at MDE, about what the regions look like. There is some talk about moving the regions all the way down to the county or ISD level, because so much of these regions like where the impact is what does it mean for schools, even though we've seen more than that. So just understand that that's a possibility. We would advocate for at least a narrowing of the regions, because right now they are pretty broad. I don't want to spend, I will get back, there's questions on here that people have posted. I'm happy to address those a little bit farther in. But, I would like to, start having you all share with each other to kind of talk about, as you're starting to work on your preparedness plans, whether it's you or your administrative team or parents or teachers, whoever they've come together, I think people on this would be interested in hearing, what are those points so far that are seeming like real sticking points, and maybe solutions that you've already arrived at based on them that others would be able to learn from you, or maybe what's a real sticking point that you would like somebody else to be able to say, maybe how they have come up with a solution in that area. So I'd like to open it up. One of probably the precursor to the sticky points is, questions have come up about including your teachers and or their representation, their union representation, as part of your preparedness plan committees to get their input into this. And I guess I would ask in the space just to get things rolling, and you can feel free to go in another direction. But that could be a place to start. Like, has that been a problem? Is that going well where you're including your staff in these conversations? If you've reached some problems there, how have you addressed them? But I would open it up right now, and you can put in chat that you'd like to be recognized, or raise your hand to be able to talk about what's some sticking points and what are some solutions that you found, or what solutions are you looking for to those sticking points. And we'll open it up right now, and I'll get back to questions as we have time. John, I see you raised your hand.
Yes, as a matter of fact, we have a email going out to parents this afternoon, and then a different one going out to staff with a little bit more detail. But basically, 2 paragraphs that I want to read here. It says, our goal is to publicly release a draft of the back to school recommendations on August 3rd, which will include all the required safety measures. We will formally present the plan to the Board of Education for a vote at the regular meeting on August 10th. But ultimately, if we continue in phase 4, parents will have the choice of either in-person or remote learning. We're not going to do a hybrid at all. And it says, should we begin the year in phase 3, only remote learning available, our in-person students will transition to learning at home with their assigned teachers. We will be asking parents to make a selection beginning August 3rd when we release the details of the plans for all phases.
Yeah, that letter sounds very similar to the one that I received as a parent in Grand Ledge, and I have seen a few other letters from districts that are doing something similarly and putting that together. Not so much what you're doing, but kind of pain points and possible solutions on those pain points. Again, you can throw in there in the chat section if you'd like to talk, or raise your hand. You're all saying you're here to learn and not to share, because you're not far enough along to be able to share anything. I did see a question posted in chat for John to answer, and I'll let him do that in the chat function. Well, you guys are tight-lipped, so I am going to look at some of the questions. There is a Brad question in here. If a school board is meeting in person, it has to turn people away due to the 50-person indoor limit. Does the board also have to offer a Zoom-like option so the audience members can participate?
All right, well, based upon this question, I'm assuming the person is asking from Region 6 or Region 8, because the way MASB interprets the current executive orders 110 and 115, only Region 6 and Region 8 can have true in-person meetings right now. So if you are in Region 6 and Region 8 having an in-person meeting, you expect a large turnout at your meeting, Yeah, definitely conduct it as a virtual meeting as well if you're going to exceed that 50-person limitation. That means you're going to be following the executive order that was issued last Friday. Executive order, I believe, is 154 that superseded and rescinded Executive Order 129. The requirements language essentially the same. There's just a new expiration date, which states that you can have virtual meetings as long as a state of emergency or state of disaster is currently in effect. And as of right now, that's going to be in effect until August 11th. And then you can even go beyond that, I believe up to 28 days because of scheduling virtual meetings as well. So yeah, if you expect a large turnout and you're having an in-person meeting, conduct that meeting virtually to give your community access to the meeting, whether it be by participation or accessing public comment during that meeting. And also we've updated our FAQs on our website. Go to our COVID-19 webpage on our website. Everything's been updated to take into account the executive order that was issued last Friday.
Brad, in your question, in answering that question, I think one of the things, and I've heard about it, is I've heard of districts that have had public meetings in the regions or in the southern half of the state where our interpretation is different. Have you heard from any of the other law firms in town and what their interpretation has been? If it's consistent in kind of the direction that we're going, or if they're being a little more relaxed and saying they think they can have those meetings?
I think it's generally consistent that if you're outside of Region 6 or 8, Executive Order 110 does not permit a true in-person meeting. What some boards are doing, though, in other regions of the state is what I call having a hybrid meeting, which in my opinion complies with Executive Order 110, where you're still conducting the meeting virtually under Executive Order 154, so you're following all those requirements, but you're allowing your board members to come in and be there in person, but it's not an in-person meeting. They're just meeting there in person, and they're still using their laptops and other devices in order to participate in the meeting virtually. So your community can still participate in the meeting virtually. So it's technically a virtual meeting, but you're still having board members come in and are able to be together as long as they're social distancing and wearing masks while they're in their enclosed space. So that's maybe what's been happening, Don.
Okay.
Having those hybrid meetings, which in my opinion would be okay as long as it's less than 10 and as long as you're still complying with Executive Order 154.
Gotcha. We had some hands up. Let's see if they're still there. I see Barbara Reed from Dexter has a hand up. I'll let her go.
Hi, so one of the concerns that I have, and I don't have the answer for it, is I'm concerned that families who are finding finding alternatives to public school right now. I know some people personally who are maybe going to homeschool or make a different choice. One of my big concerns is, will those families come back to our district after, there's a lot of turmoil and uncertainty. Dexter has not at this point said, for sure what we're doing. We do have a survey going out this week, I believe, to families. I know our superintendent is working closely with the district staff and administrators, but there's just so much uncertainty that parents are looking around for alternatives. And so that's just an issue that I see. I don't know what's going to come of it. But I hope that the families return, and I wonder if other boards are having the same issues.
Barbara, I think that's I've even mentioned that, I think, going back a number of webinars. And, John read their statement. As I said, our district is saying similar things. I think it is going to be imperative on districts, if at all possible, to offer an online alternative, because that risk that you're talking about is very real. If they, for whatever reason, feel that you're being, you don't offer, an option, maybe that's health, they don't want to come back to school because of health concerns, or they don't want to come back to school because they don't want their kid to wear a mask, whichever side they fall on, If there isn't an online option that the public school provides, they're very likely going to look at alternatives. And I think there's a real risk that if that experience is good for them, that you may lose them permanently as a public school. And I don't think that any of us think that's a good idea. And so that's why that alternative, I think, is going to be really important for every district to figure out. And one of the questions that have been posted in the chat is, how have you worked with your, not you, but how do districts, what district solutions are there in working with your association to decide online versus in person, which teachers teach which, and how that's working. So I'll be interested to see what districts are talking about that, because there's also some collective bargaining and some legislative issues that fall into that I've heard brought up, which is you can't privatize instructional education. So can a school district use a third-party vendor to provide an online education? And I'm sure some of that's going to play into whether you're keeping your teachers employed or not. If they're all working in a face-to-face setting, that's probably less of an issue than if you were laying off teachers to bring in a third-party provider.
Right.
I will.
Could I just add one more thing to that?
Sure.
There is a program, and it's many of you may have heard of it, some may not have, but it's the Oakland Virtual Learning Academy Consortium. And so that is a program that is associated with many public school districts. Dexter partners with them. And what's kind of interesting about that is students it's been an online program for, I think, 8 years. They've come to the MASB workshops and given presentations there. And the students are still considered to be in-district students, so they would be eligible for band, orchestra, sports, if there's, sports happen to take place. And I believe that because it's nonprofit, extra money that isn't used for programming or paying the staff or purchasing materials goes back to the district. So that is an option. Dexter is going to have a full online, but Oakland Virtual Learning Academy, you can just Google it and it has some good information. So.
Thank you. And I know there are some other public school consortiums that have done some online offerings in the past too. I'll turn to Denise, partly because I see her on my screen. Denise, I see your hand up, but you're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. I just wanted to share, we got a update last night from our board, and I do represent Grand Ledge. But in talking about how we are looking at the different alternatives and how that our administration have organized. And they gave us a report last night that they have 3 active teams. There's about 100 people participating. And they've broken the teams into different categories. One is for in-person education, and that all of the teams include secretaries as teachers, and administrators are the leaders. There's also an online team. Their main focus is working with the pupil accounting and the comprehensive online school. And then we have a blended team, and they're moving to or focusing on moving to a more restricted environment if in fact offsite learning is going to become a necessity. So they are very excited about having both teachers be involved, as well as secretaries. The custodial staff is getting pulled in, of course, as they're going to be responsible for the maintenance and the cleaning. They've got folks being involved in the signage and the PPE requirements as best practices. So just wanted to share that, and that sounds like it's a great organizational model that they've kind of pulled together and have allowed a variety of staff persons in addition to just the central office and administrators to get those secretaries and teachers, et cetera, involved and have them be part of the planning from the get-go. So I think that's been very well received by our staff.
Thanks, Denise. And I mentioned that we'll be putting out just a handful of questions kind of in best practice. Brad and I were involved in the meetings last week, and that's really talking about who's involved in the preparedness plan. I think what Denise just laid out that they're doing in Grand Ledge fits in the same space that we would, MASB, and this was MASB, MASA, and the unions together talking, that we would recommend trying to include both teaching staff and all support staff in you know, or their representatives in a way that, you know, includes all that are going to be infected. And when you look at some of the questions that have been posted in the chat right now, what, you know, you're hearing from around the country and in Michigan, teacher groups, custodial, different, you know, groups within your school that are, I don't know if protesting, I know that's happening nationally, but really concerned about returning to work. And I think the only way that you can help address that for those that are in your staff is to make sure that they feel, if not individually, because that becomes very hard, right? Not everybody can be a part of the discussions, but they have to feel that they have a voice. If they don't feel they have a voice in the plan creation, you're going to have that pushback, a feeling of not included, a feeling of risk of their safety and that they're not being listened to. So from a best practice standpoint, somehow having their voices at the table as that is created is going to help alleviate some of that concern, but not for all of them. I mean, that will be something that, you know, you'll in fact depend on your local EA or FT, depending on the district you're in, to help carry that message and say that they, you know, that they were a part of it and that this was representative of the majority of the staff. And so I think that that's a good way, Denise, as you laid out, and I think others, if they're not in the same place, that's a place to think about being in that space. Let's see if we have other either comments on people that have already spoken or other hands that are up. Libby Brown, I see your hand up. Oh, you're muted also. I can.
Can you hear me
Okay, now you're good.
I'm from Jackson, and we've decided on the hybrid model. 2 days, Monday and Tuesday for one session, Thursday and Friday for another session, and Wednesday will be where the teachers plan and call parents and also answer students' questions and things like that. We've had a sticking point with wearing masks, but you know, we have the South Central virtual, the South Central Michigan virtual school, so that they can go and work all online, you know, and they can work online either there in the physical building because it's associated with the public schools, or they can work from home. So they do have options. The only option they don't have is full day, everyday school. And that seems to work with us. The main sticking point that we ran into was the mask, and you know, that's been mandated by the governor. So you know, that's something that we really can't deal with. One problem that we've had too is involving the union. Our district doesn't really like to involve the union that much, and so I'm really concerned about them not being able to have a voice in this.
And what district did you say? I know you said it right at the beginning, but I missed it.
Jackson.
Okay, thank you for that. The mask wearing item that you talk about, and I see some questions posted on it, and I've talked to both board members and SUPs, you know, going back to the beginning of the summer, particularly since you've started meeting on preparedness plans, that does seem to be, depending on your district, a really tough issue. There's a question here is, what is the position of MASB for masks being worn? You know, we are supportive of the governor's executive order, and of course, you know, recommend all of our schools follow it. Short of legislative intervention, we consider that the legal procedure for you to follow. And then it's going to be a decision of, you know, the districts and the local health departments to look at the highly recommended and recommended items that are out there, and to make decisions beyond that, and to also listen to your community a little bit to see what their thoughts are on it. And, you know, it seems like Jackson's approaching it correctly in that you're giving them an option if they don't want to be there with a mask, that there is an online option. And Brad, I think we touched on this a couple, probably at the last Views webinar for sure, if not at the last Member Matters issue. the question is, should a district require a doctor's note for a child or teacher to not wear a mask due to having a medical condition? We've also had the question on, on the high risk factor, like if a teacher has high risk and so therefore doesn't believe that he or she should be teaching, do they require a doctor's note? Like, what's your thought on this? And I'm not saying it's MASB's position, but just
Sure.
generally, what's your thought on medical reasons for not wearing a mask or medical reasons for not being in front of a classroom?
Yeah, and well, if you're in phase 4 and you're required by law to wear a mask, and if teacher indicates that he or she is medically unable to wear a mask, I don't believe it's unreasonable to ask for documentation. Under the Family Medical Leave Act, you're always getting legal medical documentation when a leave is taken, and for readmittance back to work to ensure that the teacher is fully healthy and able to work again. So I don't see a concern there with requesting medical documentation. That wouldn't violate any HIPAA rights or privacy rights of the teacher.
Could you do the same thing if it was a student?
A student, same thing. In fact, I think the privacy rights are even less for a student. HIPAA is not even a factor because FERPA would apply. So yeah, requesting, particularly if you're in phase 4, where masks are required. If a student indicates that they're medically unable to wear that, again, I think it would be reasonable for the school district to request that documentation. And then if you're outside of phase 4 and you've adopted a policy, or if it's in your preparedness plan that you're going to be requiring masks, again, I think requesting medical documentation to prove medical necessity would not be unreasonable.
All right, thank you. That's a question that I think is up there a lot, is what do we do in those situations? And I know there's even compliance questions that we've had about, what do we do with a kid that refuses to wear one once they're in the school? And I know you've reverted and said, what does your policy say and how you would deal with a situation like that? And that's another piece that the board and administration will have to think about as they come up with their preparedness plan and the policies that you'll adopt tied to that. I'll look and see, or Stacy, I'll have you look through see what hands raised that we have, and I'll flip through the questions a little bit. Let's see, here's another Brad question. Some districts are asking parents to sign waivers if they send students to sports and summer activities, and even for school in the fall. Is this advisable? I'm guessing this has got to be a liability type waiver. I know you answered the question about immunity, but does a sign off by a parent give the district a better foot to stand on?
It does, and it only really applies to athletic activities where it's a privilege more than a right in regard to, or in comparison to attending school. So I'm pretty sure most insurance providers are suggesting to school districts to have parents, students sign these waivers. It's really more about accepting the risk rather than waiving liability. There's likely some waiver language in there, but the main purpose of those documents is to inform parents and to inform students of the possible risk involved in participating in athletics during a pandemic.
All right. This is a question I think for the board members and soups on here to possibly answer. Carrie asked the question from a small district perspective, but I think there's a number of questions in her post, but when we talk about virtual learning or online learning, does that mean a student's streaming most of the day? Is that, virtual learning like we did and I'm adding to her question, virtual learning like we did in the spring, or when we say that you're offering online learning, soups or board members, what does that look like for your district? If you're going to offer a virtual option for a student, I don't believe it's going to be the same thing as a live streaming of the classroom of the teacher teaching at the same time. So, you know, some clarification for those out there. When you're saying you're offering a virtual option, what's that going to look like for the students when they're taking the class? If anybody wants to chime in and give us a description on that, that would be great.
Hi, this is Leslie from Southfield. I'll kind of chime in on that.
Okay, Leslie.
Well, thanks for holding this forum. But I think that the question is definitely a valuable question to ask. But I think just put it on both my school board, and I'm also a teacher. So obviously,
Before you keep going, Leslie, could you get closer to your mic? You're hard to hear.
yeah, hang on, let me see. Can you hear me a little better now?
A little bit.
Okay. So what I was saying is, you know, wearing both my school board member as well as teacher hat, obviously in 2 different districts. The question is very valuable. However, I think it's kind of tricky to try and kind of answer that in a one size fits all. The reason I say that is because I know that being a board member in Southfield, obviously my daughter is a student in the district as well. I saw them doing their online learning very differently. Even the number of hours that the students logged on for were very different from what I was required to do in teaching in the district that I teach in. So I think there's so many formats and so many platforms that can be used. But what I will say is that is a valuable question, because it's a lot of the material that I've been reading with the 2 different districts. You really want to look for certain words and make sure that the words are very clearly defined, because some of the descriptors will say live streaming, or they will say in-person distance learning, whereas the teacher will be required. And I believe the district I teach in, that has been something that's been discussed as an option, that we would have half the class, half our students in class, and we would have video kind of streaming into the segment that we are teaching, while the other half of our students are at home watching. Whereas where my daughter is attending, that isn't something that, and where I'm a board member, that isn't something, that type of language hasn't come up in the discussion. So it's a very, again, very valuable question to ask. I think it's something very specific that each district just has to make sure that, as you're looking at the platforms, the different online platforms that are being used, because there's so many out there and that are being purchased, that it is a clearly defined expectation and understanding for the teachers, the unions, and the parents to understand what does that option mean if they're going to be expected, because it's very different for students if they have videos. For instance, the district I teach in, any student who wasn't able, so just a quick example, I had to teach from 11 to noon was my first segment. I teach 4th grade math. Any students who were not able to get on and log on to our system at that time could then view the video clips that came along with that lesson. They could view it at a different time that met their family dynamic, for computer use or whatever the situation may have been. And teachers were still expected to give them credit, even though we didn't see them logged in front of us. If they went at a later time and watched the videos and did the work, it still counted towards distance learning. So I hope that kind of answers the question, but just wanted to chime in on that.
Thanks, Leslie. And I think, to answer the original question, it really is something that you probably need to think about talking both with your teachers and your parents about what kind of option best fits their students, because it can vary. And I don't think for most, it's not going to be a kid sitting in front of streaming video for 7 hours in a day. None of the research backs up that is the best way to learn, but it can be, as Leslie pointed out, very different in that space. I did see somebody else posted again about school closure related to having a case. That is going to be a local health department conversation to kind of figure out what you would do in that situation. I see kind of a philosophical, and Brad, this might be also a legal. I've heard some people give answers on this. If a parent, or I should say a student, ends up in a virtual setting, but it's one that's offered by that traditional public school, would they then typically be eligible for extracurricular activities?
Generally, you have to be enrolled, and if you're, meeting the high school athletic association eligibility requirements, then yeah, you may participate in sports. If it's not sports, something that's not regulated by the high school athletic association, then it's really up to the school district whether they allow someone to participate. But
and I think in this question, oh, go ahead, Brad.
Eligibility. Yeah.
Anthony, I think posed the question a little bit on the kind of conundrum. If a parent is asking the question because of safety, but then asks for their kid to participate, they're saying, I'm not safe enough to go to school in person, but
man.
but he does say it's a philosophical issue, and it probably is. But even if you were going to participate in an extracurricular, depending on what it is, that still reduces your exposure a lot more than if you were in a classroom with kids circling through, particularly at the high school level, all day long. And so that, is one a question that anybody can answer, and maybe they've chimed in. If schools are going to go back, are you having some conversations, or have you made decisions on, we're coming back to school academically, but we are going to limit other extracurricular activities, choirs, bands, things along those lines because of the given situation? Are any of your school districts already kind of coming to those conclusions that, I guess I'll use an example of, marching band, where kids are standing right next to each other, particularly in the horn section, you've got, the blowing into the horn, so do we have any districts that have made decisions where you're coming back right now tentatively, but you're not going to have some events operating? Sorry for the long pauses. I'm just trying to give people an opportunity to raise their hand.
We're in Charlotte, and we have been working on the marching band concern. There was a research released about a week and a half ago talking about the spread of water droplets specifically for choir and band. There are some mitigation aspects that you can do, like there's caps that you can put over the horn section. There's advisement of how to drain spit valves in a safe way. Our marching band director feels that they can practice outside in smaller groups with a 6-foot space, because that can be a marching band configuration. Where we get more concerned is that when the weather isn't permissible to be outside in a group, where do we put the 170 students into a classroom because they wouldn't be allowed to be inside? So we're actually considering paying another music teacher an overage to be able to split them into smaller areas, more like a sectional. We are going to do band camp, but it's going to be small groups, outdoors, spaced out, with all the mitigation factors we can think of.
Jen, you also posted that your district, and I know you have a son that's in band in high school. What did they do in your district?
So we're doing band camp. They actually have mini camp. He just left for it. It's sectionals only, and it's only outside. They're not allowed to play inside at all. The band director has also they're back ordered because everyone has figured this out, but there are pieces that go over the flute, because the flute is the only instrument that just blows out into the world. Everything else goes into your horn. There are pieces to go over the mouthpiece of the flute to allow the flutes to be able to play, and those have been ordered for all of our kids. He has said they cannot practice inside as a group. And we're doing band camp, but it's only 4 hours a day, and it will be outside only. So again, they're going to keep the kids spread out. The drill is being rewritten so that the kids are spaced. But he feels with marching band, it's easier to keep those kids apart. So they're going ahead, knowing that we have no idea if when the weather turns or as school goes on, if we're going to actually be able to perform. But they've gone as far as saying there will be no uniforms, there will be no sharing of instruments. You'll take your instrument home rather than storing it at school. I'm trying to get anything that is commonly touched, only touched by one person. So that we're at that spot, but he also has warned us this could change. It's already changed twice. It could change again. But right now, that's where he's going with it. And our choir, I haven't heard from yet. Our musical, which normally goes off in the fall, has been moved to the spring. They're not going to start doing any of that. But those are the only two extracurriculars that I know of outside of athletics.
All right, thank you, John. And I know Grand Ledge's musical also got delayed until the spring of the year. Question or a post on here. It is my understanding that social distancing is not required on buses, yet it is required in the classroom. I think that's a misunderstanding. It is right now, I mean, social distancing as much as practicable is going to be encouraged, whether it would be busing or in the classroom. It is not specifically required on a bus and that they will have to wear masks. And in the classroom, it's not required that you do social distancing. Am I correct in that, Brad?
Yeah, I'm looking through the executive order, and I don't think the executive order specifically addresses it.
It's a highly recommended in phase 4, but not required, because that was one of those areas where it's health risk versus being in school, and you would push most districts into a hybrid model because you can't get down to 12 to 15 kids in a classroom.
Sure.
And still have them
I
all.
would think districts, should do all they can to properly social distance students, whether they're social distance students, whether they're on a bus or in a classroom. To me, that just makes the most sense. But yeah, not required in the executive order, from what I understand.
We've had a number of questions pop up here. We're going to say something, Jen?
The governor's executive order and the roadmap were purposely silent on that because she stated that know what schools are going to be able to do as far as social distancing. So I don't expect to see anything from her requiring it, even in phase 4. But as Brad said, it would be strongly encouraged.
A few questions have popped up about doing temperature checks on students. And one specifically says if you pivot to allowing the parents to do the temperature check before they send their kids, so it's a sign-off sheet sort of thing. It's probably similar to what we'll end up implementing here at MASB from a staff perspective. But does that change the liability, do you think, Brad, for the district, if you're having the parents do it versus a school employee do those checks?
I don't think so. Again, as long as you're following, directives, and the executive order doesn't make any reference to temperature checks, the roadmap, I guess, encourages, maybe recommends or strongly recommends that parents do the temperature checks. So, if you're allowing parents to do it, you're following the roadmap. If the district does decide to do their own temperature checks, it's permissible. There, Fourth Amendment analysis would apply on that. A temperature check would be a search for the purposes of the Fourth Amendment, but it's it's not a very intrusive search. So I think as long as you're putting your parents on notice that the district is going to be conducting those checks, should meet the standards of reasonableness under being a reasonable search under the Fourth Amendment.
Howard asked the question, does the district have a great idea how to do mass morning medical and temperature checks in? Is there an app for that? I know some people have talked about aides on buses doing temperature checks if they were going to do it that way. I actually have heard of an app in that space. It's probably something that I'll reach out to MASA on. There might be a possibility where we could, I know one other association for their members that worked with an app company to provide something to their members that any school district could access it. And it does allow, in this case, it was for private employers, but it allows an app so that their employees can go in and answer a series of questions, including the temperature question, and do it all via smartphone. You would probably have some limitations if you have parents that don't have access to a phone that would work off of an app, but there are apps out there to answer that question. But I will do a little bit of follow-up in that space to try to see if we can make something easier for our members. If that's something that MASA and we could partner in or something like that, as districts are trying to figure out how they're going to do those series of questions for kids and parents. Denise posted a recommendation, just knowledge. You may want to suggest as you're communicating with your parents that if they're not having their kids wear masks very often right now because they're not going places, it might be as they get closer to school that at home that they wear them a little bit just to get used to wearing them for a period of time. I know that seems like probably a bit of a drag and hard to do, but there definitely is going to be a period of time for, I think, kids to adjust in that space.
Don, we've got a raised hand from Peggy Casagrande.
All right, Peggy. We're not hearing you at this time.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Oh, yep.
Sorry, I was double muted. That happens. So my apologies. I just, for whatever it's worth, I wear the school board hat in Walled Lake, but I also wear a business continuity hat, and I deal with this thing that we call the COVID pandemic day in and day out. We have some questions about temperature checking. I have not seen our district plan yet. We're supposed to get it this week. I want to see the details and what we think we're going to do. But I just wanted to mention that of the thousands and thousands of temperatures that we have taken within my large defense contractor company, we have only had one person with an elevated body temperature. And we find that having self-temperature checks as well as answering those questions to be far more effective. And really what the temperature checking, what the data seems to be telling us is that it's more of a emotional, you're doing everything you can. So I don't want to discount that, but I just wanted to put that out there for whatever that's worth. And while I haven't seen our plan yet, I have a lot of concerns. Our teachers, our union, our parents have concerns. And I think our biggest thing is balancing safety and balancing finances, because we are a district that does not have a lot of fund balance. We don't have a lot of extra money. We've taken concessions for years. And how do you balance that? How do you logistically, come up with a hybrid plan? And personally, I wrestle with the fact that I can't put more than 10 people in a room unless our sector president at my personal work, that's over 12,000 people. So kind of a little bit different, but about the same size as our district. If there's more than 10 people in a room, he has to approve it. So how do I, as a school board member, approve putting 25 to 35 kids in a room when we don't even do that with our businesses? So it's really a very complex, difficult decision. And I haven't heard a lot about finances, a little bit, with the attendance and, eliminating student counts and whatnot. A lot of concern about, what is happening with other districts maybe offering something and people looking to jump, districts. We had that comment earlier. But why? I mean, I think the hardest thing to grapple with, and I'd like to know if anybody's, found the answers here, is how do you put finance or safety, ahead of each other? They're both so important, right? So that's why I want to see the details of our plan, but I don't know how to solve that. And so when it comes down to it, I personally want to err on the side of safety, because how many kids does it take to get sick, or teachers or anybody in our building, or worse than that, before we make a decision that, we need to keep them virtual, for example. So that's what I wanted to say. And I guess just looking for some comments and feedback from other folks.
Thanks for the insight on that, Peggy. I think those are tough questions that everybody's grappling with. And we're at 1 o'clock right now. I see people continue to post, much like we saw probably with the views with the governor. We've got a lot more posts than we've been able to touch base with, because I'm trying to let people talk more than us talk. I'm going to see, I've got William Gaines has a raised hand. I want to recognize him and offer an opportunity. And I think the other piece, you know, I believe, Stacy, correct me if I'm wrong, that we're recording this one and we'll have it posted. Am I correct?
You are correct. We'll have it posted
And so
in the
what
next
I
couple
might
of days
do,
along with the chat too.
for those that, you know, have the space in their day and want to remain on a little bit longer, I might go a little bit longer than 1 o'clock today, just because I think the conversation is good and I think you're sharing well. And for those that have to get off, you can always go online and watch the end of it if you need to leave. But I just want to give this opportunity. I hate to cut people off when there's a lot of conversation going on. And I did see our last one, or one of the last ones, a plan to hold these webinars on a regular basis, you know, finding that they're helpful and regular day and time. And so we'll have to think about, can we schedule them so at least they're the same, they're always at noon, but whether we can do them at the same time. The governor's was at a different time only to meet her schedule. And I know we have another views next week. So we're almost looking at weekly having stuff out there. We try to take some time off during the summer, not personally off, but thinking that there would be maybe a gap in need or numbers participating. That hasn't been the case. So we will try to keep these coming to you regularly as long as you are finding them helpful. So I will turn it over. Did you already unmute our last raised hand, Stacy?
I've unmuted. Our district has a healthy fund balance and we're spending down a big chunk of it for safety. I don't understand how you can meet governor's recommendations with the budget. You can't come close to the recommendations without more money than we've been offered. There's not a possibility of that. I've been a part of the district planning for going back, and it just, I don't see how it could possibly work without spending down the balance.
Yeah, William, I think you're absolutely right. I think frankly, I think the governor and the legislature would agree with you, not so much that they're able to come up with the money necessarily to fund the extra costs, but pretty uniformly now, even in the legislature, and I won't say across every legislator, but in general, you know, I think there is the thought that states really need help from Congress because there is increased cost in this space, and trying to implement much of what was recommended in the council related to health is going to cost districts additional money. And, you know, that kind of gets to Peggy's point of trying to balance health and finances, and that becomes a difficult thing. And, you know, if we all hope that this is a shorter term health issue, it probably still has longer term financial consequences. So it's going to, you know, you spend down fund balance, and I think that's a smart thing to do in some ways. How far down you go is going to have to be that question, because we don't know how long the tail of the financial impact of this will be, and whether we're in a full-blown recession for a year, you know, multiple years, or what that looks like. But that is a great point, William. I think that's accurate. Stacy just posted the next webinar, Views from the Capitol, which is next week. Yes, that is a rotation in days. I know that trying to do them at noon to hopefully catch you at a time where if you're at work, you can pull away. I know that's not easy, and that's why we're also recording them. Brad posted his email address for anybody that has questions that they want to ask. Let's see. Somebody actually posted, until we start, can we actually have weekly webinars? We'll have that conversation internally, Lisa, and we'll see what we can do. Maybe if weekly might be difficult. It would depend on numbers and other meetings that are going on. As you can imagine, we're spending a lot of time answering regular emails and other questions and attending meetings to try to get some of this information. So we will try to make them as often as possible to get the information to all of you as members. I see Port Huron, and I'm only going through these, and if you have a comment or a thought, please put up your hand and Stacy can let me know. Port Huron's, giving a suggestion that they're thinking about is block scheduling, so that they're doing 2-hour blocks of 3 classes each day. So it's minimizing the number of kids that can get interacted with each day and the number of kids that each teacher would interact with, and the traffic in the hallways that I know is not easy to schedule, but it is at least an option that could be out there. Worthwhile to think about that. Let's see. So Brad, Kevin's question, are you interpreting the mandatory mask wearing mandate and the strong recommendation that 6 through 12 students wear masks is the mandate which occurred after the roadmap controlling? So I think you had the roadmap maybe from the council, and then you had the EO, as my guess is what he's referring to in that space.
No, I think they're referring to the governor's executive order of last week on
okay.
Masks for any public enclosed space. And I think that's the terminology you have to focus on here, is a public enclosed space. And even though we're public schools, I don't interpret that mandate to mean that a classroom is a public enclosed space. So say you're in phase 5, phase 5, and you choose not to adopt a mask policy, according to the roadmap, don't believe you would be in violation of the executive order by having your students not wearing masks, because a classroom would not, according to that order, the way I interpret it, be a public enclosed space. But there could be clarification on that forthcoming, but the way it's written now, the way I interpret it now, I don't think it would mandate masks in a classroom if a district is in phase 5.
So in essence, you're treating the school as no different than a workspace where
Exactly,
the employer
an office
makes
space,
up
yeah.
the employer makes up the rules related to that space. The general public isn't able to access that facility.
Yeah, exactly.
Another possibility for districts as you're thinking about your plans to minimize exposure between students and teachers at the middle school, and I had heard this, was that the kids could stay in the classrooms and have the teachers rotate through even at the middle school level, so it's not a bunch of kids in the hallways at a hour bell each day as a possibility. I had one district, and I sent the question along to the council and to the governor's office, whether they might allow flexibility. We do have some small districts in the state that their elementary buildings and their high school buildings are one and the same. And that's even beyond just the one-room schoolhouses, but still that K-12 building, that's all one. And because they're that small, they typically have pretty small student-to-teacher ratios. And the question was there, similar to this model, was if you could do a self-contained classroom, and it's all in a building that you're already doing that with elementary, would they allow the expansion all the way up to 12th grade, meaning that they wouldn't have to wear masks as long as they were staying in a self-contained classroom? It's been posed to them. They're having conversations in that space similar to this junior high question, but no clarification yet. But that is another space that is coming up. I see a few people answered. Some have went with band camp, some have canceled. I did hear of one district that is allowing, so far with the High School Athletic Association, allowing fall sports, but has canceled all youth sports for the fall. I don't know what the rationale was. I haven't talked to that district, but saw that they're doing that. Other thoughts or comments from anybody? Stacy, are we seeing any hands?
Not right now.
And I did see Stacy posted, as we're, I think that all of us, I think Jen and Brad and I continue to wait for the next EO or the next FAQ from the governor's office to help give you clarification. So as much as you're all starved with it for information, we can be that way at times also. And so, along with these webinars, I think that, and I see Carrie, you raised your hand, so I will recognize you and you can unmute. But I'll just say, like Stacy also posted, our Summer Institute coming up on the 14th, while it is only a couple of days before you have to put your plans together, we are going to have a panel of school district and public health leaders talking about things. And I think every district at this point is expecting that even what you adopt in August will change probably multiple times, maybe even this fall or even during the course of the year. So, you know, please, if you're available, think about being a part of that, because we'll be talking about both academics and health in that space. And we're going to be talking about the whole child in the first half of that day, which I think probably this year, more than any year that we're ever going to face, it's going to be important to be thinking about what is happening with our kids beyond academics. Carrie, you have your hand up and feel free.
Yes, we did have a school board meeting recently, and I think one of our bigger challenges is, I mean, obviously there's lots of them, but another one of them is the lunches and how some schools are handling or thinking about handling that. We've considered we have a smaller school district, obviously, so it would be a lot easier, but like warming trays, bring them to the hallways, kind of leave them. The box lunches packaging is kind of inconvenient, more time consuming. Obviously the kids wouldn't be able to leave classrooms. Just curious on whether other school districts have considered, you know, how they would handle that. And then the other thing is it required that, you know, if students are working remotely, do we need to provide them for lunches?
That would be a question, I think, you know, what you posed there for others to chime in on. What are you hearing about doing for lunches, or what you're planning on doing for lunches? And do you expect, if your students are virtual, and of course in the spring, that's a little different than what we're dealing with now, but if they choose a virtual option, are you thinking about still providing a way for them to access your lunches? Districts that would like to chime in, if you've had those discussions, I think it would probably be helpful for everybody to kind of hear what that might be. Seeing any hands, Stacy? Oh, Libby, I see you have yours up.
Yes, we're going to do lunch in classrooms. So students will go down to the cafeteria, you know, section room by room, and then they're going to be taking their lunch back to the classrooms and eating there. Now, virtual, we've been providing lunches all summer. We provided so many for kids all summer, but we haven't really discussed the virtual if we'll provide for them yet. That's a topic we're going to be talking about.
Thank you. Other districts that you have made decisions in that space? I think some of it, Carrie, might be just that it's too early and we haven't got to that space for districts yet to have made those decisions. Similar to what Libby's saying, I've heard of districts that are talking about either warming whatever, you know, drawers aren't appropriate in this case, but the option where they're wheeling lunches down to classrooms, or in this case, having them go one by one. The one by one option, of course, if you're in a larger building, creates some pretty strange times for kids to eat lunch, just because of how long it will take them to process through. But you know, that is a viable option, and maybe still the best of some bad options, if that's what we want to call them. Another question that popped up is to have schools answer this. If you're offering the online option, and we're not talking about in a shutdown phase 1 through 3, but in a phase 4 or 5, when do parents get to make a decision to change that? So I make a decision as a parent to go online. Do I wait until the end of the marking period? Is it the end of the semester? Or are you allowing them to make that switch at any time? Or are you holding to them? So anybody that has insight, I know a lot of you have put out there that you are offering the online option, and maybe I'm wrong in assuming this, but assuming that some discussions have happened there, do you know what your district's thinking about when those choices are going to be allowed, and when a student can opt to go back into in-person, or if they're in person, to opt into online? I want Denise to answer only because it's my kid's district, and so then I would have my own clarification, but that's probably unfair.
Hey, Don. This is Anthony
Yes.
from Northrop. Right now, we've decided to do for high school semester and trimester for our elementary. So if they go virtual, those are the two timelines that we're looking at.
All right, thank you very much. And I am assuming for most districts that they are going to use, you know, a trimester or at least a marking period. I think it would be very difficult for a student to move back and forth. Denise, you actually raised your hand, so I'll let you answer.
So as far as I know, that we are talking about doing that by semester and by tries for elementary, but that has not been finalized. But that was my understanding. So we're still working out those details. And I think that's exactly what's happening with all these districts as far as the specifics like lunch, et cetera. They're trying to get so many other things in place before they make those decisions. But my understanding was it will be by semester and or try versus high school versus elementary.
And I think for those districts particularly that are doing it through your own teachers, and so that means you're surveying your parents right now to know how many are willing or want to go online, how many want to be in person. Switching, you know, 5 weeks into this doesn't work very well because it really changes your staffing. If you're contracting it out and saying, here's an online provider that's going to be in the classes, that might be different because a kid might be able to drop into an algebra class. But even then, like from an educational standpoint, what that looks like, unless they're going to spend 3 weeks in algebra in person and then drop into the beginning of an algebra class online, like they're likely going to see some repetition. It would be very hard to, unless your virtual learning is actually watching on Zoom the teacher in the classroom and doing it that way, which means then you could probably drop back into the classroom because you're going along with your kids anyways. But I don't perceive that much of the virtual and online offerings are going to be just that. I know Leslie did mention it this spring that one of the districts was doing it that way. Whether that will hold true or not is a question. So I'm going to scroll back down to the bottom of the chat to see what people have said. Some of them are answering leaning towards end of marking periods, ends of semesters. You know, Jen put out there, and this is one that she's asked for often, is as you're putting together plans, as you are running into issues, make sure that you communicate with us if there are things that you see as legislative. We can't ask the legislature to fix them, and I think you can communicate directly too. But at the same time, let us know so that we can definitely follow up with the legislature and ask those questions. I think that is very important. Port Huron mentions they will continue to offer lunches to those that are in online learning. So did a couple of other districts. So it seems like
we got one more raised hand, Don, from Jeff Brown.
Okay, and I'm going to say we're going to wrap it. We're at 1:20, and many of you stuck around, most of you, in fact. But I want to recognize all of your time and the staff that are on this. I know that they have other things going on, so I'm going to go with this last question. And then this will be posted along with all of the chat that is here. And then we will see you again next week when Jen hosts the Views from the Capitol. But let's go to the last raised hand. Is that Jeff that you were referring to, Stacy?
Yes.
All right, Jeff.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Don. Thanks, Stacy. Trying to handle answering questions here with this supposed Green Bay lamp behind you there, Don. So anyway, sorry, had to say that. I just wanted to share a couple things. We've been at Gull Lake. We've been in the virtual online education world for about 11 years. We do this pretty regularly, and our plans really are to offer all options to students, in person, a hybrid, or virtual. And what we're looking at right now is a platform that will allow our staff to be able to move back and forth easily between online or in person, depending on what the circumstances are and what might happen to our particular region. So we're hoping that that opportunity might continue to be there. And we know that the seat time waivers are a critical part of that. We've run up against the cap on those ourselves, actually, with some of our alternative and partner programs before, and hope that can be changed. Because we've had that experience, I might also share too, based on the comments that were being made earlier around extracurriculars, is that we've always had our kids that have been participating in virtual be able to participate in all the different activities, whether it be band or sports or anything really that we're offering to our regular brick and mortar students. So the other thing that we've learned that's critical in the online interaction is this, and this is part of the way student accounting looks at this stuff, is that there needs to be ongoing two-way communication between students and teachers. And that is a critical thing, and it has to be a component that you build into your plans, because it isn't something that necessarily always happens. And you not only have to do it, but you have to be able to document it and prove that in fact it did happen between each one of those students. And this may address some of the questions that folks had posted before about, well, you know, how do you know if they're participating? How do you know if they're really engaged? The two-way communication does do that. You know, it's another way for the staff to be able to continue to interact with the kids throughout the process. So I just wanted to share those things. From our experience, we are actually supporting the ISD and all the districts in our county in some of their efforts for virtual education, since we've had quite a experience background in that, and particularly in terms of being able to get staff up to speed and having folks feel comfortable on both ends of the spectrum there.
Jeff, just a couple of follow-ups. You mentioned a platform to allow teachers to go back and forth. Do you know what platform you're looking at?
Well, we are using several different platforms right now, you know, Odysseyware and some others, but we actually there's a new one, and I just was talking to our super about this, and I can't share because I don't recall the name, but this is a platform that, in paying a small fee, will allow us to be able to be fluid and moving back and forth. I think it's like $28 a student or something like that allow us to be able to set up that in a situation where we can be fluid enough to support kids. And, you know, it may also not just be a regional change in our status. It may be individual students that choose and parents that say, you know, this online thing is not working, or it is working. I want more of it, I want less of it, and allow them to do that, and really still part of the same classroom cohort, so that it's not like you're asking folks to switch gears in the middle of it and have a different instructor and a different curriculum being delivered. So I think that's a positive move, and I think it's something that ultimately will be in the best interest of kids, perhaps even beyond this point, really.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate point. I think because you're far along in the process, because you've been doing it for a long time, you are more capable and maybe more aware of what things can happen. And in the first year of it for districts, it will be more difficult to have that kind of level of flexibility. But clearly, I'm sure those in your county are appreciating your experience and the learning that you had to do on your own that will help them now at this point. So
yeah, we had a lot of hoops to jump through and a few lawsuits and a whole lot of other fun along the way, but it all worked out. And now we kind of got this. We know how this works, and it does make a difference.
I did see somebody post a question to you. You mentioned it, and you may not have this detail. Do you know what the seat time waiver cap that you guys bumped into, what that number is?
Boy, not in terms of raw numbers. I do know that the waiver that we had only allows us to show 10% growth a year. Okay. And, you know, and we've run into problems with that because we have more demand than that for our virtual.
So that's where you've ran into things.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you all for participating. Hopefully you don't begrudge us going an hour and a half. You stayed on, so I hope that's not the case. And I just appreciate what you're doing in your districts. I know that these are not easy times. You have tough decisions before you. I will say, in listening to you and watching your questions come across today, maybe I'm preaching to the choir, but it seems like districts are doing what they need to do in this space, and you are reaching out and trying to work within your communities, within your teaching staff, and I appreciate that. And I think over time, your local constituents, if they don't right now, will also come to appreciate the work that you're putting in during this time. So I just want to say thank you very much and have a really good week. And make sure that you reach out to us if you have any questions. You don't have to wait for webinars. Jen, Brad, me, or anybody else on our staff. Don't hesitate to reach out when you have questions. Thank you.